Another reason that you cannot just say, oh, I just did a questionnaire study, that is confusing because questionnaires, they're also used in experiments, as later on we'll see. So when you say, I just participated in a questionnaire study, then people might ask you, well, what do you exactly mean? Do you mean you participated in a survey or you participated in an experiment? Because questionnaires can be used in both types of methods. Okay? So that's why we should not use, should not confuse these two terms, right? Should not confuse questionnaires with surveys. Survey is a method. Questionnaire is a tool, is an instrument. Okay? An instrument to be used in this method. Okay, a second sort of terminology is respondents. Respondents simply mean, people who complete a survey, right? They respond to this method by filling out questionnaires. Population. Population has very different meaning than the term as is used in census, right? We say that America has a population of, I don't know, however many million people. But the population used in the context of surveys simply means the entire body of people or individuals that you intend to study, right? Um, Census is a survey study on usually, right, the entire population of a country or the entire population of a city, a county, a certain school. Okay? So for example, if your goal is to find out UHM students' views on legalizing marijuana use, then the population for your survey will be UHM students. But if your goal is to find out what Honolulu citizens think about legalizing marijuana use, then your population will become Honolulu citizens. Okay, see, the population would differ depending on the specific goals of your survey. Okay, so it's not a constant, it's a variable in itself. Sample is a subset of the people that you're able to study. So sample is really a subset of the population. Okay, so you have a population. Let's say you want to study UHM students' views on legalizing marijuana use. So UHM students will be your population. Okay, let's draw it out. So UHM. So let's imagine that this circle includes each and every student enrolled formally at UHM, right? So this will be your population. But for many reasons, you can't simply have access to each and every UHM student because you don't have the time and resources to survey every single one of them, right? Some may not attend school regularly, so you're bound to miss them, right? And some might, I don't know, decline to respond to your survey, so you don't have their responses. And some, for various reasons, you could not get their responses either, right? For example, they don't read English. I'm just saying. So, for many reasons, most likely because of your limited resources and time, you can only obtain the responses from a group of UHM students. These will still be UHM students, but obviously they are only a subset, a section from the population, right? So this will be your population. And this will be your sample. Make sense? Right? Sample is a subset of individuals from the population that you intend to study. Okay? So most survey studies, not surprisingly, because of limited fundings and limited resources by researchers, they can only study samples. Okay. Okay. So now that we have learned about these terminologies, we can start to talk about different types of survey studies. So the first sort of distinction that we can make is a distinction between cross-sectional survey research and longitudinal survey research. So to understand the difference between these two types of research, we can rely on this cube, or this cubic thing, to facilitate our understanding, right? So let's imagine that this cube represents the population, whatever it is, right? It can be UHM students, it can be Honolulu citizens, it can be all Hawaiians, right? Depending on your goal of your study. So now let's denote or treat this line representing time. So we have the past, we have the present, and we have future, right? So now imagine, let's have this surface. Let's use this square or whatever you may, or plane, right? Let's use plane. Insert this plane vertically into this cube so that it will have a surface that intersects with the cube. Okay, and we'll call the portion where this plane intersects with the cube a cross section of the population, right? Exactly this part. This, let's imagine, is where this plane meets, meets the cube. Okay, there are other parts of this plane that does not meet the cube, but let's call the part of the plane that meets the cube a cross section of the population. It's only part of it, right? At the particular time, which is close to now, right? Further, let's from this population draw a subset of it. We'll obtain a cross-sectional sample, right? This square thing, that will be a cross-sectional sample because it's a subset of individuals from a cross-sectional of the population, right? There are other parts of the population here or here that this plane does not touch upon. So we cannot know about what people in the past think about an issue, or people in the future will think about an issue. We can only learn about, in this particular case, what a subset of individuals at the present think of a particular issue. So we'll call studies based on a sample of respondents at one point of time as cross-sectional research because they're based on cross-sectional samples. Okay? So we can ask, between or across individuals contained in this cross-sectional sample, do their attitudes differ, right, on whatever issue that you are interested in? Right? Do they think differently in terms of legalizing marijuana use? Do they think differently in terms of gun control, etc.? Right? Or you can ask, among the individuals contained in this cross-sectional sample, is there any correlation between their political ideology and their attitudes toward various socio-political issues? Okay. All right. So that's cross-sectional studies. Okay. Focusing on a sample of respondents at one point of time. It could be in the past. That's okay, right? You can obtain historical records, right? For example, there are now many survey results available to the general public that are conducted in the 70s or 60s even, so that we can learn about, what people back in time thought about certain issues. So again, we're studying people's features at one point of time, so that would still be a cross-sectional study. Okay? So let's return to the cube with time. This time, again, we'll use this plane, insert this plane into this cube to obtain a cross-sectional sample, right? So far, we are only looking at a cross-sectional sample at one particular time point. So far, we have a cross-sectional study. But imagine we repeat this process at 2 more time points and focus on the same group of individuals, right? So they're at the same position of the plane. So let's imagine that they're containing the same group of individuals. But now we're studying them across 3 time points. And because of this feature, we call it longitudinal studies. That is, the most classic longitudinal research studies the change of a group of individuals over time. Okay? So for example, you can ask, do people's attitude toward certain issue change as they mature, right? And as another example, right, if you find a correlation between people's ideology and attitudes at one time point, for example, when people are very young, you can ask, well, is this correlation stable? That is, when they become older, does their ideology still predict their attitudes, right? So you can study the change over time. So in general then, right, if we compare these 2 types of survey studies, we'll notice that they have different goals and, their focuses are different. So cross-sectional study is best at comparing individuals, right? It only has one sample of individuals, and we focus on the features of these individuals at one time point. So what you can do is to compare one from each other, right, or against each other within the sample. But the focus of longitudinal study is different. What it compares is change over time, right? Do people in the 60s have different views than people in the 70s? Do people in the 70s thought about things the same way as people do or did in the 80s, etc. Right? So the focus of comparison for cross-sectional study are individuals, whereas the focus of comparison for longitudinal studies are time or time points. Okay, so far we have briefly gone through, the first 2 uses of survey studies. We can describe patterns, right? How many people are for or against a particular issue. And we also said that because survey studies can use questionnaires that contain different variables, and whenever we have two or more than two variables, we can start to uh, uh, examine the correlations between all those variables. So they're good at establishing correlations. But the third key feature of survey study is they can allow us to generalize our findings beyond the samples to the entire population. That is the issue of generalizability. And we shall focus on this particular feature of survey studies in the rest of this lecture. First of all, let's define generalizability. Generalizability, whenever we talk about it, that is, whether or not we can make claims based on a smaller sample of people about a larger population. And whenever we're asking ourselves this question, that is, can we generalize our findings to a larger population? Regardless, we are essentially asking whether our sample is representative of our population, right? So this representativeness of a sample essentially means or refers to the idea of the extent to which, right, our sample resembles the target population. So now we need more terminology. So we know what population is, the entire collection of people that we intend to study. And now we have a sample. Sample is a subset of people from the population that we're able to study. And generalization is to make inferences about a population based on the features of a sample. So let's make this idea more concrete. So let's say you want to find out what all UHM students or undergrads, to be even more specific, think about a certain issue. So this will be your target population. Okay? Now, because of the limitation of your funding and resources, you're only able to study a subset of it. More specifically, the money allocated to you will only allow you to study 3,000 from all UHM students, which of course is not all UHM students. So now we have a sample. Now, based on the sample, you find out that about 80% of the people that you surveyed favored legalizing marijuana use. Okay, I'm making this number out. Making this up, right? I don't know whether it's 80 or 75. This is just for the purpose of this class. So now you have a concrete number. Now you have a concrete answer to a question that is, how many students favored legalizing marijuana use. But now, pay attention. Your goal is not to study how many students out of 3,000 favored this particular issue. Your goal is to study how many UHM students favored this issue. And there's a critical difference here, right? Your goal is to study how many UHM students favored this issue. Your goal is not to study how many out of these 3,000 favored this issue. But because of the limit of your funding, you're only able or capable of studying what these 3,000 UHM students thought. So now there's a gap, right? There's a gap between your finding here and your goal of study. Your goal is to understand the thoughts of all undergrads. but you were only able to find out what 3,000 of them thought about this issue. So, in order for you to claim that among all UHM undergrads, it will be a similar finding, that is, similarly 80% of UHM students favored legalizing marijuana use, you are making generalization. You are generalizing the finding based on a sample to the population. And this is quite a leap, as you can imagine, right? The key for us to make this generalization is to make sure that your sample is very, very similar in terms of all aspects that you can think of to the target population. And by that, we mean, representativeness, right? To extend your sample is similar to the features of your population. Another way to think about it will be, to imagine a sample or population is like this, okay, of a particular shape. Let's say this is your sample. Sorry, this is your population. Okay, this is your population of this particular shape. So if you would like to make generalizations, that is to generalize the findings that you have based on a sample to the population, you want to make sure that your sample, despite being smaller in size, right, because it's a subset of the people that you can gather from the population, you want to make sure that despite this subset of people is certainly smaller in number, but it will look very much like the population, right? There we go. Not identical, but similar enough. So in this case, you will have a what we call representative sample, right? This is your sample. And because you take great effort to make the sample look similar to your population, you are able to obtain a representative sample. Okay? So the findings that you obtained from the sample can be generalized to the population. In contrast, right, if this is your population, and now because of many reasons, you obtain a sample like this, which is not even close to be identical, right, to be similar to the population. So now your sample is not like your population. Your sample does not resemble your population. The features that you collect from the sample do not correspond to the features of the population. So in this case, you don't have a representative sample. The sample that you collect does not represent the population. Therefore, you don't have the ability to generalize your finding based on the sample to the population. You cannot make, in other words, generalization. Okay? So this is what it means. There we go. To determine whether a sample represents a population, or to make sure that your sample is representative of your population, we must rely on a critical process that we'll call sampling. Okay, sampling, as we said here, is the process at which the individuals are selected into your sample. Right? There's a reason for, in other words, that you must specify to let your audiences and readers know why you include this particular group of people, or more importantly, how you select them, right? Do you select them because you simply like them? Do you select them because they're simply available? Do you select them because of the procedures that you describe before you go out to sample them, etc. Right? So this is a very, very important procedure to consider. And we'll talk about sampling more and with greater detail in the class tomorrow. Okay? So I'll see you tomorrow then.